Okay, so it perhaps goes without saying what I mentioned quickly before, that there was this enormous investment in Germany after World War I in particular, but also before, in the new technology of artificial flight. The very name Axis, of course, for the Federation of Fascist States, reflected this notion that we were now moving away from the notion of empire by contiguity, according to geographical earthbound divisions and overlaps, and now something that was connected by the new technology of flight was also a possible form of organization and governing, as it were. This is modeled, of course, on a certain, in part, phantasmatic perception of the British Empire as being based on sea power. Gesundheit. If you look at Carl Schmitt's essay on Hamlet, for example, Hamlet or Hecuba, which appeared relatively recently in English translation, he goes to some length in linking certain powers of Shakespeare, as it were, but that's not where we're going to go right now, but linking it all to the advent of the English investment in sea power. And he does the math, whereas there might have been 14 million citizens of France at the time, and around 40 million people living in Central Europe. There were only 2 million or so on the island at the time that Henry VIII first made this investment. And from there followed, out of that, out of a new calculation, because formerly, of course, one depended for empire on bodies, a new calculation that issued the foundation of empire. So, closing that aside now, let's just say that the investment in a German empire was riding on the back of air power. And yet, of course, that was the first setback in the course of the Battle of Britain, which soon reversed itself into Germany being at the disposal of air raids really early on. As a kind of footnote, I would like to mention that at no time was an attempt made to improve the air defenses, which interests me. This Central Psychotherapy Institute received the commission to develop a new kind of air shelter group psychology, where in one of the treatises that I remember reading, it was suggested that through the air shelter community, one experienced a kind of return to nature. But in any event, while there was a psychotherapeutic attempt to support the grounding of the populace by air attack, there was no technical or functional increased attempt to counter the attacks, while at the same time, limitless, anyway, an enormous amount of funding went into rocket research. The decision was made early on to invest the rockets with the now distant but hoped-for position of Wunder or wonder. This would be the Wunderwaffe that allowed the Germans to the end to believe in the Endsieg, the final victory or triumph in multiple quotation marks. I keep on stressing that I get this through reading their essays, because I'm sure someone could prove me wrong in the details, but something I read suggested that what was amazing about the construction of the German fighter planes, that there was little consideration, so this author claimed consideration for the reality of fighting in the air, in other words, fighting between planes. But whereas the RAF planes had several outlets for machine gun fire, the German planes only had one machine gun in the back, almost as an ornament or an afterthought. So that one sees after the fact, if this is true, and maybe something else could also be found to be true to support this, that we are always already building the rocket through the limit we encounter as failure or loss via the Air Force, via the launching of the planes to secure initial fantasy, which becomes the initial loss. Okay, so keeping in mind everything that I said about the temporality of the fetishist stipulation, let me just repeat myself and say that the loss, the failure of Air Force, of the initial investment in artificial flight, is after the fact reclaimed as having delivered as its byproduct the triumph or miracle of rocket flight. In it, everything after the fact seems to be incorporated. If you read the so-called psychotechnical essays written beginning in the 1920s by military psychologists or psychotechnical experts, the pilot was all along identified as being at the limit of, at the biological limit of man's relationship to technology. Biologically, the pilot could only, for the time being, make certain psychic adjustments that could be prepared for through training that would allow him to bracket out the way in which our senses also mislead us when it comes to artificial flight and how it's organized. So that even though it can only last for a limited time, according to these studies, while it's working, the pilot aims through automatization of functions for something like automatic pilot. And this is what finally, as accomplished, one can say after the fact, gets incorporated within the rocket, which not only pilots itself, as it were, once launched, and it does through feedback and negative feedback structures, also doesn't have to think about defending itself. It breaches the very consideration of defense and is built to explode, to fall, ultimately triumphant. Now, for consideration alongside all of this, I brought two clips. One from a relatively recent German film called Geprüfte Seelen, Teststand 7, and one from Fritz Lang's A Woman in the Moon, Frau am Mond, which was made 2 years after Metropolis. The film, Geprüfte Seelen, Testament 7, is a copy of tape, and it's a little hard to navigate through it to find all the clips. What I found hopefully will provide us with some of the information and even some of the metaphoricity built into the construction of the V2 rocket. That film is about an allegorical figure that searches for her origin, as it were, in the V2 rocket. It's at the same time the only filmed version, or a permitted film version, in part, of Gravity's Rainbow by Pynchon. He allowed this, with certain excerpts we filmed, included in this film, which in many ways functions as a documentary. In case this does not come up in the documentary, I need to say a few things about Woman in the Moon. It is the film that set itself up at the point of crossover into realization. I think that's very important for understanding what I'm trying to pursue here with or as German science fiction. Lang was very careful to include all the rocket science experts available at the time in the design of the rocket, including notably Obert, who was considered, or is considered, the father of German rocketry. He was from Transylvania, by the way. And then there's also Billy Lai, who later on went in the States. He actually left Nazi Germany, so he was in America when Van Braun joined him, and then co-authored some of Braun's popular science books. But he too was involved, and von Braun himself was, I think, a 16-year-old, was hired as assistant by Obert. So there was a lot of technical know-how invested in this, such that during the Nazi regime, this film could not be shown in its entirety. There are certain moments in the film where you see the plans for building the rocket, and it was considered to reveal the plans for the V2 rocket. So that was always excised. I guess there wasn't a copy that still could circulate in the States. I don't quite understand how that works. But anyway, the regime made sure that there wouldn't be a complete edition of the film for that reason. When the film premiered in Berlin, not only these scientists who acted as advisors were present, but also Einstein himself was one of the stars of science and popular science at the time. And Obert was supposed to have built a functioning rocket that at the film's premiere would take off. It would have been the first successful takeoff, but that failed. It awaited von Braun's later realization. What I'm trying to say is that there is already a tenuous link on the way to realization in the film itself, more so than one could really ever say about science fiction up to this point. I believe I'm right in saying that. Another footnote. Fritz Lang, who never really made it in Hollywood, though he made beautiful films, but they weren't continuous with his German films. And so, as you know, he developed a new specialization, as it were, in noir filmmaking. And his German films were not really remembered, as it were. Coming to the States meant being divorced from the earlier, his earlier career, as it were. But the exception, to some extent, was Woman in the Moon. Not that the film was that well known, but because the insiders knew the film, well, of course, Männer von Traum, Lung would sometimes be invited to NASA ceremonies on the occasion of countdown launching. Obert was also invited on one occasion, but, and here I look forward with you to Dr. Strangelove, if you haven't seen the film. At one point, he said later, ironically, cried out "Heil Hitler" at the launching, and was never allowed to participate again. I think that takes us to that threshold. Let's look a little bit before we break at test stand 7 and see whether I'd rather do it now because there's an outside chance it will be lost when we try to find the clip, in which case I'll just give it up. I haven't kept up with the latest probes, but we're getting closer.
And I only asked that from a less Aldrin perspective. But I was just appreciating thoughts you might have on.
It was always championed, even within this history we've been working through, as the first real step over. The moon is considered only as a rehearsal step, with all the hopes for colonization have always been placed there. I don't know more about that. Unhappily, I haven't followed closely, as I said, all the probe results. But we'll be reconsidering that again, I guess, when we look at what K did. He's always populating Mars. To think about California. Yes?
I had a question, not from today's class, but last lecture.
Yeah.
And you were talking about 1984 by George Orwell.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that you had a critique of it that it didn't include references to the Holocaust.
Well, I cited Pynchon, who wrote that in his preface.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's what I was trying to mention.
But I think Pynchon is right up to a certain point. I just thought it was important that he say it. The way he said it came close to this genealogy of a kind of staggering of encounter and responsibility that I was pursuing other things. But no, that's it's a particular edition to which Pynchon contributes the preface, and then Fromm contributes the afterwards. It's a good edition. More associations, dreams. Yes.
I just thought it was a little uncanny that on the rocket there was a woman with a picture of a rocket and a moon. And it just seemed to me to sort of fit in with the notion of fetishism and the actual sort of physical. I mean, we didn't go into the. It just seemed to fit in with the woman or the mother and the loss of the penis and sort of castration. It seemed to sort of just fit in there uncannily.
And I don't know whether that was clear from the film, but that is the actual logo that was put upon every one of the V2 or A4 rockets, and by von Braun. And it's considered, it doesn't recycle an pre-existing logo, but it's considered a reference to Woman in the Moon. But you're right, it has also at the sexological level and a fetishistic aspect to it. I had one question earlier that was about the relationship between psychoanalysis and technology, let's say, in the context of this kind of reading. And without going into, again, what we're doing here and now, I just wanted to remind you that this is the point of, as I answered to earlier, this is the point of dispute between psychoanalysis and Heidegger. Heidegger in his pursuit of the essence of technology says in passing that psychoanalysis is itself part of technology and therefore cannot pose the question of technology. And Derrida quickly pointed out that that's, well, why not? I would say that psychoanalysis, as the world encountered with World War I, to my mind, demonstrates psychoanalysis at certain junctures. This is the significance of the endopsychic perception, becomes what it's talking about, for lack of a better formulation. And thus asserts external reference, thus includes external reference or extends external reference. So for psychoanalysis to address technology, as it were, it has to become or internalize and become, might be misleading, but it does have to become part of technology in order to be able to step outside itself or back inside itself with an external reference and address it, tabularize it.
Actually link then in others, in what others talking about technology might actually relate to the discussion. Because in a way his interests in technology has never been in classifying everything as technology, but only eruptions in thought or knowledge that have new truths and therefore supersede others. I think his view, everything that was superseded or therefore somehow proved to, for which there was proved some other new way in the past, was not technology anymore, so they were the objects of the past becomes the same technology. And in that sense of looking at it as a process, like moving the process to around to something, and not the thing itself, like the gadget. The difference between the gadget and the process, the virtual diagram of the gadget.
Right.
Only those being technology, maybe in that way, then.
That's what he means. Absolutely. You're referring to Heidegger, right?
Yes.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'm sorry if that was unclear. And the point is, he's not disagreeing with developments in psychoanalysis as well, but I'll get to that in a moment. But Heidegger's point when he, in the course of that dispute, is that technology is not about machines. It's not about technology. It's about a kind of ready positioning for the advent of technology, which is something that happens discursively, for example, and in many other ways. So the understanding, even the history of technology, has to precede, as you say, objects of study. But in the course of the technology and psychosis research that follows out, folded out from Freud's encounter with Schreber's memoirs, one has a similar situation. And the best example for what I'm thinking about would be an essay that I've not copied for you, but still recommended. It's from 1932 by Hans Sachs, Hanns, and then Sachs, Sachs, who was another close follower of Freud. And his essay called The Delay of the Machine Age attempts to be among other things, a kind of projection of the consequences of the Schreber reading as a history of sorts. And he sets himself up as following both Freud on Schreber and Hausk on the influencing machine that I referred to briefly. Some of the punchlines I think I've already incorporated and referred to, but let me just say that what he takes over is at once a history and a kind of topos, in other words, thinking about antiquity as the standard for measuring development since in a kind of historically, often kind of dialectical way. And so he asks the question, which I think is interesting, how is it that the Greeks, or the Romans for that matter, did not invent machines? So it's another way to go about the kind of prefatory thinking about technology that Heidegger was standing up for, as it were. And so he says all the knowledge, even all the conditions were available for the development of recognizable technologies, machines, in antiquity. And yet, the machines or gadgets that were invented, and they were restricted to the status of playthings. So never was, at that time, could machinery be projected and realized as something to be put to work, and thus to be prosthetically part of our functioning. And so he mobilizes what we covered before, the difference between primary and secondary narcissism. So he suggests that historically, only in antiquity was it possible to extend the stay within primary narcissism, to remain living within the proportions set by the body. Everything about that culture did not contradict bodily proportions. There was no, anyway, he argues, no sublime register, for example. There are many ways to supplement that observation. The use of slaves, in other words, of other bodies, as a way of extending one's limits or supplementing one's limits. And he says that only at the frontier, the outer limits of antiquity, does one begin to see the incipience, as it were, of that crisis in uncanniness that usually descends upon an extended stay in primary narcissism. So in antiquity there were sort of zombie figures inhabited the outer reaches of this otherwise bodily proportioned civilization. Yeah.
Weren't there some weapons technology, like catapults and...
Once we get to Rome, right.
Okay.
No, that's a good point. I'm not standing by this. I'm just. It's the only thing you need to remember, but I'll finish filling in a few of its details. Is the question: why didn't we invent technological objects as soon as we could? The weapons are a good counter supplement. You're right. But anyway, his suggestion is that that machinery that would interrupt, as it were, the bodily proportioned civilization could not be created, invented. it or whatever. And so he says, this is what we see in psychosis. And this is the part I mentioned before. At least that psychosis that makes it into the phase of recovery, that the psychotic is unhappily unable to remain for an extended period of time within primary narcissism, unlike the Greeks, as it were. And so to get out of the crisis of uncanniness, out from under the zombie body that takes over, the psychotic projects a machine, even an influencing machine, that allows for another kind of survival. So all that I'm wanting to suggest here is that question, is there a possibility of being capable of imagining, projecting, what have you, machines that precedes the actual realization? Because that introduces a lag, or what he calls a delay, Verspätung, in the genealogy or understanding of technology itself. If we were to look at the beginning of Metropolis, for example, this would be a good illustration of Sachs's conceit. I think I mentioned this already, that what you see is mock antiquity, the pleasure garden, where the privileged youths are kept in isolation from the techno-reality of the city they are being raised to govern. And then the whole story is about the traumatic, but then bound traumatic initiation into Via Maria, into this underworld of technologization. At first contact, a Moloch, a zomboid, voracious monster that he hallucinates in the place of machinery. But then that leads to another kind of stabilization, which is, as I argued, is in the case of this film, at the same time encrypted.
It's like not really the same thing, but when we were talking about this projection, like these technological things, that then just creating this kind of lag thing too, that I thought it was like with Daedalus and like Icarus then too. Is that? I mean, that was interesting Greek, like this myth of saying like, so it's like flying, and it just has a sort of strange similarity to the idea of like the rockets and or being able to do that in a weird way, like kind of flying close to the sun. Maybe I'm totally off, but what is that then? Or how does that relate to what he was saying with the antiquity? And then not, or being in the underworld like that.
Well, I don't want to push his point, but one could argue that all of that is about the attempt to fly that is still, proportioned according to the body. It's entirely a bodily experience that's being evoked, and the limits that are in the body, not just in gravity, or gravity is an extension of the body. That brings this down as the staging of hubris, staging of the acceptance of limits. So I don't find that necessarily a contradiction.
Well, and so many early attempts at flight were like they tried to emulate birds instead of creating this technological flight. It's much more of an embodied, maybe we could be like these animals.
Yeah, it was through the bicycle. We learned how to fly. At least that's how the right purpose felt. Certainly, Sachs isn't talking about tools and basic prosthetic functions. I don't know if that would cover your observation about the weapons. I don't know. Those are still within the range of the recognizable range of the prosthesis. He's talking more about they had the capacity to build a steam engine. Why did we have to wait so long? That's the question Sachs is asking. Okay. I'm going to say one more thing, and then we're going to look at a section from Woman in the Moon. Ever since the new syllabus was distributed electronically, I've lost track of our schedule, as it were. But the film that I wanted to show, but perhaps won't, is one that I just want to mention now, is the film Contact. Have you all seen it? Oh, good, but I don't have to show it anymore. But what interests me about that film, in juxtaposition to some of these Lang films, for example, and within the various delays I was also talking about last night, is, you might remember, that moment of contact, which uses the first large-scale live TV broadcast, which was the coverage of the Berlin Olympics in 1936, as the medium for encrypting and transmitting its message to us. It's an amazing, it feels like the return of something in the middle of this space fantasy. And I think we're perhaps in a good position to recognize that it is in fact the return of a larger connection. But that falls by the wayside of the main story, I guess, which, as you might recall, I'm just going to spell it out briefly again, is a story of one woman's own death cult, which links her to space and to contact. Is the attempt initially through radio, ham radio, or whatever, to inhabit long distances with her father as superintending. And she asks at one point if one would make contact with the dead mother as well. And then the whole space fantasy or realization, first buffered by the Nazi TV show, is then buffered by the alien simulation of her memories of her now dead father. So what interests me about that film is that in reaching into a historical underworld, as it were, the woman who can stabilize this contact in a dissociated way is the woman who's been building her death cult really from childhood onward. She provides the crypt that makes this surprise flashback to the discarded German history of German science fiction legible, only for a moment. I don't think the film merely neutralizes it, though there is that argument that this is simply a certain kind of frequency that they have to use, whatever. But it brings us back, I think, to some of the arguments that I suggested with regard to the stabilization of a kind of psychotic outer space for its exploration and even habitation. So we're going to look at it's a rather lengthy procedure, but just the same, I want to look at the complete introduction of the rocket from the middle of the film, and the takeoff, and then stop before we get to the landing, to the moon. I think one begins to see something like a techno-metabolization of the figures involved, with the woman at the front of the line. In passing, let me just mention that this is the first countdown in history. Lang chose this way of counting down from the larger number down for aesthetic reasons, as it were. He said that there would be no tension if I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, because the audience would have no sense of what the goal was. Whereas if I counted in reverse, the audience would be there. And of course, ever since then we've been doing it. I want to say a little bit about the text, the narrative by Thea von Haubu again. This is a classic Oedipal story at the border again, at the border to psychosis. We have the classic story that already is common in German expressionist film. If you think of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the staging of the power of the death wish over a trio in which the figure is odd man out. So the narrative begins, as does the film, but we're not going there. The narrative begins with 3 close friends who are gadget lovers, and suddenly one of them decides to ask the one woman to marry him. And that wounding of odd man out prompts him to accelerate the plans for takeoff. First, he's even going to go without them, so that this is really made explicit in the narrative, so that he can turn that wound into something else through the takeoff. However, a pseudo-reconciliation follows, and they all go, taking along with them the one identifiable psychotic, a certain Manfred, a pioneer, rocket visionary, whose plans, whose theory that the moon contained all kinds of gold and other treasure, or supplies, resources, natural resources for the good of the earth, made him a laughing stock, which drove him into obscurity, really delusional, made him into a delusional outcast. Okay, so having said that, that much is important that you see that the narrative sets up takeoff as there to work the magic of transformation of a severely depressed mood. Having said that, I think we can look at the what follows to complete the scene of the successful takeoff is that a kid who's a groupie or fan of the space traveler stars stowaway in the ship. A lot of these elements briefly continued in 2 or 1.5 Hollywood films at the start of American science fiction. Destination Moon is the official first Hollywood science fiction film, considered in film history sometimes the first science fiction or space travel film, from 1951. And a lot of money was invested in it. It was a kind of takeoff itself. A lot of publicity. And then some other filmmakers decide to make their film first, a film called Rocket Ship XM. And even though histories don't acknowledge it as the first, it was literally the first American science fiction film. And its story thematizes the race in a sense, because in that film, because of mistakes made in the course of flying to the moon, they accidentally fly to Mars instead. And landing there, they put on space outfits to explore the planet, and the outfits, which I think were recycled from or sort of fireman outfits or something, but they look just like gas mask outfits from World War I. On Mars, they encounter a ruined civilization, ruined by nuclear power, and reduced to a kind of savagery that they then have to survive. They don't make it back, but before their crash landing, they're able to transmit as broadcast the document of their unsuccessful trip, but then the epilogue says it was successful because they'll build the next rocket right away. So what's striking about the film is would be not only the reference to the past, those details, the props from World War I, but also it is immediately a film, which is not the case which is not so in Destination Moon, for example, or in many of the space travel films that we follow. But here we have specifically 4 men and a woman, and one stowaway figure as well. What's more, just to complete this, the film was purchased by a science fiction fan, an American in the 70s. I wonder if you could still do that. He just owned it completely and decided to improve it because the film was so rushed. There wasn't money or time to film some of the transition scenes of the spacecraft moving, taking off and so on, which he then supplied, and I don't think we have an original print any longer. But if we did, by all accounts, what they used instead to save time and money were test films of takeoffs of V-2 rockets in New Mexico. Because right after the war, the V-2 rockets were brought to New Mexico. So the first takeoffs on American soil took place with the captured rockets. Anyway, they're embedded in this rogue film that tried to beat the official film to the punch. I'm interested in ways in which certain legacies are incorporated at the very moment that they vanish. Because we are certainly here with this film, as you saw, not only attending the first countdown and takeoff in history in some weird kind of way, but we're also at a high point of German science fiction, at which point it vanishes into a series of realizations that will lead to the shutting down of this phase, and will issue into the new, as I argued, the new use to which Germany is put in science fiction as the problem of integration of psychopathic violence in the various post-war worlds that are regularly addressed in post-war science fiction. There's always a final war that has led to a certain problem of survival and integration. So that brings us to the end of the first phase, I think, of German science fiction, or to the end of German science fiction.